Hello, students. Today we are going to study a new chapter, The Old Clock Shop. This chapter you can find in elementary reader book, The Pact with the Sun. This lesson expresses how honest and correct ways can win over any situation. With these days, even robbers can be tackled rightly. The way Mr. Ray not only protected himself but showed the right path to the robbers as well. It conveys the message of peace and good for all. It was Christmas Eve and was closing time for shops. An old clock shop owner, Ray, was still working on a clock. Two men, one in his 20s and one in his 50s, entered Ray's shop. Ray gave them a notepad and a pencil telling them that he was deaf and dumb through his sign language. Ray noticed that the man had a gun in his pocket. He thought that he had come to his shop to rob him. Understanding their dire need of money, Ray told the old man that he exchanged good sum of money with people against their watches or wall clocks. He did this for goodwill and not in want to earning interest or security against the things. The old man showed his old wrist watch to Ray, and Ray in return offered him a $50 note. Both of them knew in their hearts that the watch was not of that high a price. But this made the man happy as he got money without hurting Ray, and Ray also escaped from being hurt. Before leaving, the old man wrote to Ray that he could be back soon to get his watch. The story concluded peacefully, giving a sweet and simple message of peace on earth and goodwill towards all. Now let's start the reading and explanation of the chapter. Before reading the first paragraph, I am going to read the 3 points which are given. It is Christmas Eve and closing time for shops. Ray's old top shop is still open. Two shoppers call at this late hour. The first word in this story you can see Christmas Eve. The meaning of Christmas Eve is the day or the evening before Christmas Day. It's a 24th December. Christmas Eve had arrived. At last minute, shoppers were going home. A thick white sheet of snow lay over Salt Lake City, USA. Yet the lights were still burning in the old clock shop. As Ray, its old deaf owner, worked on a clock he had sold that day. It was Christmas evening and it was the time to close shop at Salt Lake City in USA. But lights in Ray's shop were on because he was repairing a clock that he had sold. Ray, the owner of the shop, was old and deaf. And this was a Christmas Eve. That's why all the shops were closed early because it was a celebration time. Now, let's move to the next paragraph. Having finished his work, Ray stood up and was on his way to the back room when a cold rush of air from the front door hit the back of his neck. After finishing his work, when Ray got up, a cold wave of air touched his neck from the front door. He turned to meet a last minute shopper, but his old, wise eyes told him that this was not a shopper. he saw two men, one in his 20s and other closer to 50. The younger man remained at the door. The older man approached the counter with no sign of friendliness in his eyes. Ray was able to hide his growing fear as he slowly pushed a notepad and a pencil across the counter. He turned to see the shopper who came to his shop at the last minute, but as a wise and experienced person, he noticed that they were not shoppers. He saw two men. One was young and the other was middle aged. The younger man stopped at the door and the middle aged came to the counter. His eyes were reflecting the cruelty of his heart, but somehow Ray wisely hid his fear and slowly pushed a notepad and a pencil towards them. Now let's move to the next paragraph. He smiled at the unfriendly face, then pointed to his ears and shook his head from side to side. A quick look of surprise changed the man's face as he studied the notepad, then turned and said something to his friend. The information on the notepad brought a change on man's face. He smiled and then, with his gesture pointing on his ears and shaking his head from one side to another, told the other man that he, the shopkeeper, was deaf. Ray used the chance to look closely at the man, paying attention to the shape of a gun and a restless hand in the man's right coat pocket. Anger boiled within him, but it was kept down by an inner voice that said, "Be still." He wrote on the notepad, "May I help you?" For the first time, the older man looked directly at Ray and smiled, a cruel, mocking smile. They both understood why he was there, why his friend remained at the door. They looked like men who were down on their luck and were now ready to try something they would later be sorry about. This gave Ray some time to look and examine the main man closely. He observed the shape of the gun and his hand movement in his coat's right pocket. Ray was feeling angry inside, but his wisdom asked him to cool down and be still. He asked the man writing on notepad if he could help him. With this, the man looked straight at the Ray and smiled. It was a cruel smile, as if making fun of make something. They understood the reason for their being in the shop and of the one man standing outside at the door. Ray was looking at them as unlucky people who were trying something for which they could repent later. In next part of the story we can find 3 points more. Ray knows that his visitors are in need. He accepts an old watch in exchange for a good sum of money. The message of peace and goodwill spreads everywhere as the old clocks cry Merry Christmas. The clocks ticked on. Ray calmly wrote another message. "Have you come to pick up clock or watch?" Then he pointed to the lone board filled with hanging clocks, had pocket watches. He was not a pawnbroker, but at the same time couldn't say no. to the needy people who placed their old watches or clocks before him for anything they could get. He loaned more than he should. They would be there when the owners wanted them back, at the same price he had paid with no interest. Ray knew at the heart that these visitors were in need of money. Ray quietly asking, writing a message if they had come to take a clock or watch. Understanding their need, Ray also pointed to the loan board filled with hanging clocks and pocket watches to tell them that he gave money as loan in exchange for people's old watches and clocks. He was not a man who gave money to the people to take some security in return on earned interest. Rather, Ray did all that to help needy people. It was because of his helping and kind nature. Let's move to the next paragraph. Then the older man seemed to feel a little easier, took out his hand from his pocket, and quickly looked at the watch on his wrist. How much will you give me for this? The man wrote. This made the older man feel happy, feel easy. He looked at his watch on his wrist and asked Ray what price he could offer him for that. Ray noticed a little shame in the grey eyes looking at him. The watch was nothing special and yet had great powers. It was something to exchange, a way out of a bad situation, knowing that great need had brought the man to his shop in the first place. Ray asked, how much do you need for it? The reply came back on the notepad, whatever it's worth. Ray felt that the man was a little ashamed. The watch was not of great worth, but it was special because with this Ray could turn around a bad situation and come out of it safely. Understanding the man's need and helplessness, because of which he was into such a bad act, Ray asked him what was his need. The man replied to Ray, writing on the pad that he could pay whatever was the worth of the watch. Now let's move to the next paragraph. Ray reached into his cash box, pulled out $50 note, and passed it into the man's hand. As they shook hands, Ray looked into the man's eye. They seemed to say, thank you. They both knew the watch wasn't worth that much. Before turning to leave, the man wrote, I will be back to pick it up as soon as I can. Merry Christmas. Ray went to his cash box and took out a $50 note. He handed it to the man. It made him happy. The man expressed gratitude. Both of them knew that the watch was not of that high price. Before leaving, the man said that he would come back to take his watch as soon as possible and wished Merry Christmas. Let's move to the last paragraph of this story. The little story ended on the half hour with the clocks striking all together. The timepieces, which had been looked on silently all the while, rang out the time with such feeling that even Ray thought he could hear them. Their sweet musical message was filled with hope, the timeless message on peace on earth, goodwill towards all, was felt by the three men who stood in the old clock shop. The small story ended on the half an hour with the clocks. They all strike that particular time, together witnessing the whole incident. Their musical striking bells produced a music which spread a message of hope and peace. The music was so sweet and impactful that it seemed as if even deaf ears of Ray were also able to feel it. The sweet and hope filled message of goodwill towards others and peace on earth was felt by everyone. The message of peace and goodwill is spread everywhere as the old clocks chime Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas. This wonderful lesson we can summarize in our own word. It was a Christmas Eve. Ray Old Clock Shop was still open even at that late hour. The old man and deaf owner was repairing a clock he had sold that very day. He stood up to close the shop. Just then he saw two men coming to his shop. One was in his 20s, the other was close to 50. The younger one stayed at the door. The older man did not seem friendly. Ray kept his head cool. He wrote on a paper how he might help him. He held pointed to the board with the old clocks and watches hanging on it. He did not lend money on security, but he was gentle enough to help the needy. The older man took out his wrist watch from his pocket. He asked how much the shopkeeper would give him for that. He was surely in a bad situation. His great need had brought him to the Ray's shop. Ray was very kind and generous. He loaned more than the watch was worth for. He pulled out a $50 note from the cash box. He put it into the man's hand. They both knew that the watch wasn't worth that much. The man below, before walking out of the shop, wrote that he would be back to take away his watch soon. He also wrote Merry Christmas. Soon the clocks struck the midnight hour altogether. They gave timeless message of peace, hope, and goodwill in the world. Let's move to the exercises which are based on this chapter. The first question is, what made Ray think the visitor was not really a shopper? Let's move to the text and see the answer. Here we can see the older man approached the counter with no sign of friendship in his eyes. Ray was able to hide his growing fear as he slowly pushed a notepad and pencil across the counter. He smiled at the unfriendly face. They pointed to his ears and shook his head from side to side. A quick look of surprise changed the man's face, and he studied the notepad and turned and said something to his friend. Now, we can write this answer like this. Ray was deaf and dumb, but a good judge of man. His old wise eyes told him that the new visitor to his shop at that late hour was not a shopper or customer. There was no friendliness in his eyes. So he examined that the visitors were not a buyer. The second question is, why do you think he had come to the shop? Let's move to the text. In this paragraph, you can see Ray used to chance to look closely at men, paying attention to the shape of the gun and restless hand in the man's pocket coat. Now, from this paragraph, we can understand that visitor had not come to the shop to buy anything. Perhaps his intention was to loot the owner of his cash. He was in dire need of money. The third question is, how did Ray communicate with them? In this paragraph, we can see he slowly pushed a notepad and a pencil across the counter because Mr. Ray was deaf. How did Ray communicate to the How did Ray communicate with him? Ray could neither speak nor hear. So he communicated with his customer by writing his message on a notepad. The visitor also wrote his reply on the paper. In this paragraph, we can see Ray was able to hide his growing fear as he slowly pushed a notepad and a pencil across the counter. Now let's move to the next question. What do you think? The man said to his friend who waited at the door. In this paragraph, we can see the older man approached to the counter with no sign of friendliness in his eyes. Ray was able to hide his growing fear as he slowly pushed a notepad and a pencil across the counter. He smiled at the unfriendly face, then pointed to his ears and shook his head from side to side. A quick look of surprise changed the man's face as he studied the note, then turned and said something to his friend. The older man pointed to his ears and shook his head from side to side. Thus he conveyed to his younger companion that the shop owner could neither hear nor speak. Let's move to the next question. The fifth question is, Ray was not a pawnbroker. Why then did he lend money to the people in exchange for their old watches and clocks? Ray was not a pawnbroker, a person who lends money on the security of some item. He did not lend money on interest. He was, however, kind and helpful. He couldn't say no to the needy people. Let's move to the sixth question. The watch was nothing special and yet had great powers. In what sense did it have great powers? because the watch was just ordinary, but it had the power to pull a person out of a bad situation. The older man got the money he needed without hurting Ray. The generous shopkeeper also escaped physical injury. In this sense, the watch had great powers. You can see they both knew the watch wasn't worth that much. Before turning to leave, the man wrote, I will back to pick up this soon as I can. Both men were, were also understood, and the shopkeeper was also. The watch was just ordinary, but it had the power to pull a person out of a bad situation. The older man got the money he needed without hurting Ray. The generous shopkeeper also escaped physical injury. In this sense, the watch had great powers. Let's move to the seventh question. Do you think the man would ever come back to pick up the watch? No, it is very unlikely that the older man would ever come back to pick up his watch. He had, after all, got a price higher than the watch was worth for. The next question is, when did the unfriendly face of the visitor turn truly friendly? Let's see in the text. In this paragraph, we can see the answer. Ray reached into his cash box, pulled out the $50 note, and passed it into the man's hand. As they shook hands, Ray looked into the man's eyes. They seemed to say, Thank you. They both knew the watch wasn't worth that much. Before turning to leave, the man wrote, I will be back to pick it up soon as I can. Merry Christmas. Now, here you can see the answer. The unfriendly face of the visitor turned friendly when he got a $50 note for his ordinary watch. He felt obliged and happy. The message is hiding behind this the old clock shop. The moral of the story is that one should harbor goodwill towards everyone, help them in need, and peace should prevail everywhere. The values we can learn from this story is peace on earth by doing a kind act instead of any violence. In this story, a clock shopkeeper named Ray was working in his shop on Christmas night. Two men came to his shop with a gun in their pocket. Ray saw that gun, but he acted very calmly and asked a man if he needed any help. That man needed some money, so he sold his old watch, and Ray gave him $50 for his old watch. After that, both men left the shop. Because this is the story before Christmas, so the Christmas message is also imbibed itself. God dwells in pure hearts. Love binds man to man and God to man. He imbibes divine nature into sinners. That insight is Christmas, which is not a ritual but reality and revelation. Jesus came to seek and save the sinner, to heal the brokenhearted, or to destroy demonic works and to establish his kingdom of peace and joy on earth, where hostility, turbulence, and division rule. So, this is The great message behind this, the glad tidings of his birth were brought first to simple shepherd through the angel Gabriel, Jesus the good shepherd and the light of the world. So here you can see Mr. Ray has given a wonderful message, a wonderful experience to that robbers, because they have changed themselves. They become they became loving, and they forgave everything. God's love towards the deprived and oppressed. The message of the Christmas, that where there is a hope, love, light and life, the plan and purpose of God will reach.